Welcome to the Hoja on Architecture podcast. Climate Responsive Architecture Chapter 9, Vernacular Narratives and Architectural Education. Architecture is never just about the physical act of building. It is about meaning, identity, and how human beings narrate their existence through space. Every structure tells a story, whether it is intended to or not. Vernacular architecture in particular carries with it the deep narratives of adaptation and resilience. These are not abstract tales but concrete responses to the challenges of climate change, material availability, and cultural practices. A wind tower in the Middle East is not merely a striking silhouette on the horizon. It is the story of communities learning to capture breezes long before the invention of air conditioning. A Mediterranean courtyard is not merely a pleasant feature of domestic life. It is the story of families gathering in spaces designed to regulate heat, provide shade, and foster social cohesion. A stilt house in Southeast Asia is not only a clever structural decision, it is the story of generations confronting floods, designing ways to survive and thrive in watery environments. These examples remind us that vernacular architecture is a library of environmental storytelling written not in words but in timber, stone, and clay. Yet in our current era, these stories are often silenced. Too often, vernacular architecture is reduced to images in tourist brochures or nostalgic evocations of the past. Its more profound lessons are overlooked in favor of a superficial aesthetic. But stories matter. They provide continuity across generations, shaping how communities understand themselves and how they plan for the future. If we reduce vernacular to decoration, we strip away the narratives that hold cultural knowledge. To honor vernacular properly is to recognize that every form is a chapter in the history of adaptation, resilience, and collective intelligence. These are not museum pieces but living stories, still capable of teaching us if we choose to listen. The role of education in this process cannot be overstated. If these stories are to continue shaping architecture, they must be actively taught and transmitted. For decades, architectural education has prioritized modernist ideals, technological prowess, and the visual language of globalization. While these have their place, the absence of vernacular wisdom has left a gap. Students are often trained to look to international magazines or star architects for inspiration rather than to the lessons embedded in their own cultural landscapes. To correct this imbalance, education must embrace vernacular not as a quaint footnote, but as a central component of sustainable design thinking. This means incorporating case studies of local traditions into curricula, encouraging field work that engages with communities, and teaching students to analyze buildings not only as forms, but as responses to specific climates and economies. Consider the impact this shift could have on the next generation of architects and designers. If they learn from the start that sustainability is not a fashionable add-on but an inherent quality of well-adapted design, their professional outlook will change fundamentally. They will approach materials differently, recognizing that locally sourced options often carry both ecological and cultural value. They will see spatial arrangements not only in terms of style, but in terms of microclimate, community interaction, and resource management. They will be able to design with humility, aware that many solutions they seek already exist in the wisdom of the past. In this way, education serves as a bridge between vernacular narratives and contemporary practice, ensuring that stories are not forgotten but reinterpreted for new contexts. The narrative dimension of architecture also reaches beyond professional circles into the public realm. Communities must be included in the process of remembering and reinterpreting their architectural heritage. Public exhibitions, workshops, and cultural programs can play a role in making vernacular stories accessible and relevant. When people recognize the intelligence of their traditional buildings, they often feel a renewed pride and a more profound sense of identity. This is not only emotionally powerful, but also politically useful, as it creates public support for policies that protect and adapt vernacular knowledge. A community that sees its heritage as a living resource will defend it more passionately than one that sees it only as a nostalgic backdrop. We should also acknowledge the power of media in shaping architectural narratives. Films, documentaries, podcasts, and digital platforms can bring vernacular stories to global audiences. A photograph of a mud brick village can be aesthetic, but a narrative about how that village stays cool in 40-degree heat can be transformative. By telling these stories widely, we remind people that architecture is not just the privilege of elite designers, but the shared wisdom of humanity. Storytelling, in this sense, becomes a tool of resilience, mobilizing awareness and inspiring change. Education, however, is not only about transmitting existing stories but also about generating new ones. As we adapt vernacular principles to contemporary needs, we are writing the following chapters of architectural narrative. A housing block in a modern city that incorporates natural ventilation is not simply a technical success, it is a continuation of the story of wind towers. A school that uses courtyards for cooling is not just practical, it is an extension of the narrative of Mediterranean domestic life. In this way, contemporary architecture becomes part of the same continuum, adding to the library of human adaptation rather than severing itself from it. The danger of neglecting narrative and education is that we risk fragmentation. Without continuity, architecture becomes detached from place and people. Buildings become objects of consumption rather than carriers of meaning. Students graduate with skills in design software but with little understanding of how architecture has always been tied to survival and culture. Communities lose sight of their traditions, and with that loss comes a weakening of resilience. The climate crisis, however, demands resilience above all. This is why narrative and education are not luxuries but necessities. They ensure that the knowledge embedded in vernacular architecture remains active, shaping not only how we build, but how we think about building. As we look ahead, it is essential to see narrative and education as interlinked. Stories without education risk becoming sentimental, while education without stories risks becoming sterile. Together, they form a powerful engine for change. The stories of vernacular buildings inspire. The education of designers and communities ensures that inspiration becomes action. If this combination can be embedded into our cultural and professional systems, we may yet succeed in carrying the wisdom of the past into the demands of the present. This chapter reminds us that architecture is never neutral. It always tells a story, whether acknowledged or not. The question is whether we want that story to be one of disconnection, waste, and amnesia, or one of adaptation, resilience, and continuity. By embracing vernacular as narrative and education, we choose the latter. We choose to remember and to teach. And in recognizing and teaching, we prepare ourselves to act. The next step will be to consider how these narratives, once revived and trained, can meet the technologies of our time. For the future will not be built on tradition or technology alone, but on the dialogue between them. This is the end of the Climate Responsive Architecture Chapter 9, Vernacular Narratives and Architectural Education. Thanks for listening. See you in the next episode.